Hello, I am Christopher Preble, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program here at the Stimson Center. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar. I am joined today by my colleagues Elizabeth Threlkeld, Senior Fellow and Director of the South Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and Geoff Wilson, Distinguished Fellow and Senior Advisor of the National Security Reform Program here at Stimson. And Geoff is the lead author of this report. This is the subject of our discussion today, Gambling on Armageddon, which I had the great privilege to co-author with Geoff and our colleague, Lucas Ruiz. We are thrilled to have you join us today. The topic is the U.S. nuclear modernization and its implications, both for the United States and for global security and nuclear proliferation. The United States is currently on a path to modernize its arsenal. That includes all three legs of the nuclear triad, as well as the development of new weapons and warheads. The estimate that we used in our paper was $1.7 trillion over 30 years, but I believe that number has actually ticked up since we published our paper back in February. So I think Geoff might get into that a little bit. What we try to argue in this paper, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is how this buildup fits within a broader arms race, nuclear arms race globally. What are some of the things that are driving this modernization and this expansion, both here in the United States and around the world? And we will also get into sort of some of the alternatives. One thing I'd like to engage a little bit, perhaps, is the issue of arms control, which at the time, again, when we wrote this paper, we were somewhat pessimistic about. There have been some noises, perhaps, in the last 2 months suggesting that we maybe were just a tad too pessimistic. I'm not going to say we should be optimistic about it, but not slam the door shut on the possibility of arms control. But we'll get into that today. We'll be with you for the full hour until the top of the hour, and so there will be time for questions. Please put those in the Q&A function here on the Zoom screen. We'll review those questions and we'll get to them over the course of the hour. So what I'd like to do first is to turn it over to Geoff. Geoff, what would you like people to understand most about this paper? What are the key takeaways from your perspective, and what are some of the lessons that we should, and how should that inform our approach to nuclear modernization and nuclear weapons in general?
Thanks, Chris. And look, this is a complex topic. When I first got my first job in the nuclear policy field in 2011, my dad, who's like an old Washington foreign policy hand from the 70s and 80s, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Nuclear weapons, I thought we figured all of that out already." So if that came from a guy who reads 4 newspapers a day, I think we can all infer a little bit about the level of attention or criticality that most Americans have given to nuclear weapons since the fall of the Soviet Union. But unfortunately for all of us, nuclear weapons issues are making a comeback right now. Nuclear weapons are increasingly being discussed in congressional hearings. They are taking up increasingly large portions of our defense budgets. They're once again being brandished by autocrats and democracies alike in international discourse. And they may be returning to communities, both in this nation and abroad, that have not had to host them for more than 30 years. In just the past couple of years, nuclear coercion has been threatened or intimated by nuclear states that are bogged down in conventional wars against non-nuclear states or even against non-state actors. We've seen open hostility and cross-border conventional strikes between nuclear peers in South Asia that our colleague Elizabeth can talk more about later. And once again, this idea of a limited nuclear war is being discussed seriously by military commanders and statesmen around the globe. All 9 of the world's nuclear weapon states are modernizing and expanding their arsenals, and there have been many new proposals for new and more disruptive nuclear weapons. Sort of what's old is new again here. And I think that more and more people are starting to wake up to this idea and feel the return of this specter of what President Kennedy called the nuclear sword of Damocles hanging over us all. Now, when Chris, our colleague Lucas, and I started to think about tackling this subject last year, We discussed our concerns with some fellow colleagues from a broad coalition of organizations focused on nuclear weapons, fiscal accountability, and military effectiveness and reform. And we all came to this general consensus that there was really something pressing to talk about here, especially regarding these challenges of nuclear weapons modernization here at home and sort of the modern conceptualization, the way that we talk about nuclear deterrence. The first major focus of this report that we wrote deals with issues of modernization. So going back to 2011 and following the signing of the New START Treaty, which limited the size and type of deployed Russian and US strategic weapons, Congress and the Obama administration kind of came to this grand bargain, right? That Republicans in the Senate would ratify New START in exchange for an agreement to modernize and redevelop parts of the aging nuclear arsenal. Now, that agreement in 2011, which was initially pitched as a comparatively modest $214 billion program, like Chris said, has increased to a $1.7 trillion program over 30 years to replace every single leg of the U.S. nuclear triad. So the strategic bombers, the ICBMs, and the SLBMs, the silent, stealthy submarines that patrol the world's oceans. The projected cost of this effort is absolutely staggering. And yet the dollar amount, as well as the decision to proceed with replacing all three legs of the triad at the same time, has faced comparatively little scrutiny, I think. According to a 2023 Congressional Budget Office report, the total U.S. nuclear modernization cost, that $1.7 trillion figure, was estimated to cost American taxpayers some $75 billion a year between 2023 and 2032. To put that into context, that's the equivalent of 2 Manhattan projects every year over this 9-year period. Unfortunately, like Chris said, the CBO has just updated those numbers last week and said that the total nuclear modernization costs have grown to about $190 billion over this 10-year period, meaning that instead of $75 billion annually, we're looking at $95 billion annually now. So it's even more than what we estimated in our report. But even with this monumental fiscal and resource commitment, we've seen very little return on investment on these programs over the last decade. Costs have ballooned, timelines have slipped, and all 3 marquee programs of each of these strategic modernizations is facing significant delays right now. I think that the Sentinel ICBM program, which is frankly just a fantastic case study in the dangers of sole source contracting, is more than 80% over budget today, and I think essentially 20 years behind its development schedule. The CBO noted in their top line of that recent report that we just talked about that this is one of the primary cost drivers in this $190 billion in growth. Significant problems have been encountered with the silo complexes and this realization that new Sentinel missiles probably won't fit in old Minutemen silos. In December, the Air Force admitted that it was probably going to have to reopen the contract to new subcontractors. In January, the Pentagon quietly announced that it was ceasing all new silo development, even though that's the thing needed to field the new missile. And we just heard a couple of weeks ago that the Air Force has now said that it's likely that they will have to life extend the current Minutemen missiles until at least 2050 if we want to maintain an ICBM force at all. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that that was something that the Air Force said was impossible many times over the past decade while defending the Sentinel program in front of Congress. And now essentially Americans are going to be paying for 2 ICBM systems in the hopes that we get one 20 years after it was supposed to be rolled out. It's not just an Air Force problem, though. We've likewise seen cost overruns, contractor penalties, and delays in the Columbia-class submarine program, which I believe is now the first boat is 16 months behind schedule. And I think that there's potential funding for Ohio LEPs in this new budget reconciliation deal that Congress is considering right now. We've also seen the B-21 fall behind its first flight timeline. There's a number of critical issues that are facing this process. But despite these issues and the very real fact that increasing costs and manpower and resource requirements are likely siphoning away valuable resources from other critical national security priorities, these issues have not led to a reevaluation of nuclear weapons priorities. In fact, and this is a bipartisan problem, the only conversation that anyone seems really willing to have on nuclear weapons is not what is necessary to meet our deterrent requirements, but how much more money can or should we be spending to get there. I realize that sounds cynical, but it's really sort of how we feel. This led Chris and I to sort of come to our second big question, which is the current U.S. nuclear strategy actually based on deterrence? We're talking about introducing new weapon systems now. And we've heard in SASC hearings over the past year that this $1.7 trillion program is essential but not sufficient to our nuclear needs, that we need to be introducing new theater-based weapons, new tactical weapon systems, that we should be exploring sort of older perceptions of nuclear deterrence. For us, we argue that the term deterrence has been bandied about so much in modern political and ideological discourse that it's essentially become diluted into a concept that's largely synonymous with power projection. This has both made it useful to those that want to sound tough on national security issues and also distasteful to those who are seeking a less militarized approach to foreign policy. But for us, that original core concept of nuclear deterrence is a strategy designed to avoid or discourage open conflict through outward projection of capability, preparedness, and resoluteness. This understanding necessitates some uncomfortable truths about nuclear weapons. First is that nuclear deterrence is essentially an unproven and thus far, luckily, untested theory. And that, if it ever really does fail, we'll probably never be able to put the taboo of nuclear use back into Pandora's box again. You only get one chance at sort of maintaining, a nuclear deterrent. Second is that strategies of deterrence stand in stark contrast to those of superiority, which we conceptualize as those concerned with the ability to outfight, outmaneuver, overpower, or coerce an opponent due to significant advantage or power disparity. Now, in today's sort of contemporary political and national security environment, which sounds more like a successful political talking point, right? The strategy that's based on sort of dissuading or discouraging a potential opponent, or the one that's focused on outfighting, outpowering an opponent due to significant technological advantage. I know that this is a lot, and I'm going to get off my soapbox here, but I think that we really need to drive this home. And it matters because the new weapons proposals that we're starting to see come forward in new funding requests deal with these sorts of weapons. I'm specifically talking about weapons here that are meant to be used at this theater level alongside conventional forces. And for instance, the proposed new sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, which would be based on conventional warships, something that President George H.W. Bush removed from the conventional Navy. This is a weapon that the former Secretary of the Navy and Chief of Naval Operations both had been saying for years that the Navy did not want, and that would force significant complications and opportunity costs on their conventional forces, especially the attack submarine force. But now is getting a $2 billion boost over the next 4 years in this current reconciliation bill. That is a significant down payment on a weapon system that has been criticized as being more usable, right? And which could we are particularly concerned could present a discrimination problem for U.S. adversaries who can't tell the difference between a conventional cruise missile and a nuclear armed cruise missile on a radar screen. That's a scary proposition, especially when they would be launched from ships that are capable of carrying both systems. That's a major problem for deterrence. I think that if we needed to learn anything from the last Cold War, it was that deterrence relied on assurance and not assumptions or uncertainty. Merely possessing more weapons didn't do anything to make us any more safe. In fact, on more than one occasion, those assumptions and uncertainty led us precipitously close to disaster. Today, in a world, this is something that Chris's team works a lot on, but in a world where gray zone conflict is becoming increasingly commonplace, no one benefits from introducing more uncertainty into where, when, or how nuclear weapons might be used. And Chris, Lucas, and I felt that it's critical that U.S. policymakers and experts in the field reevaluate our deterrent needs, turn away from our current sort of everything and the kitchen sink approach, and develop and deploy a more realistic modernization plan based on a comprehensive strategy for success. For us, if you care about ensuring deterrence, this maximalist approach with the associated cost overruns, the timeline delays, and new weapons introductions is arguably proving more disruptive to deterrence than beneficial, and especially in a world where the last strategic arms control treaty is set to expire next year. This, we feel, really sort of runs the risk of accelerating a global nuclear arms race. If the only thing that your idea of nuclear security is based upon is just having more than the other guys, there's no endpoint to where that may be. The enemy gets a say, right? He will also be building, they will be developing, and it increases the likelihood of more disruptive and dangerous systems being introduced to combat forces. And so we came to three major conclusions. First is that in the face of seemingly uncontrollable cost expansion in the modernization program, systems that seem to be increasingly infeasible, like the Sentinel missile, for instance, should be reduced or entirely abandoned in order to free up resources and ensure that essential programs and platforms like the Secure Second Strike Submarine Force can be prioritized. Second is that U.S. lawmakers need to eliminate proposed tactical nuclear weapon system that pose a discrimination problem to potential nuclear rivals. This is a really big deal for me in particular in this sort of new multipolar nuclear world where trust between nuclear adversaries is at an all-time low. It is essential that the United States draw a line between its nuclear and non-nuclear forces. This is especially true when it comes to arming one of the most ubiquitous weapons in U.S. conventional arsenal, the cruise missile, with a nuclear warhead. If U.S. adversaries cannot tell the difference between a nuclear-armed cruise missile and a conventional armed cruise missile on a radar screen, the world risks sleepwalking into a general nuclear war in any conflict involving the launch of a U.S. cruise missile. And finally, and haven't had time to discuss it here, but this administration and future administrations should publicly recommit the United States to not conducting future explosive nuclear testing. We believe that a resumption of explosive nuclear testing would dramatically undercut U.S. national security objectives. While, like I said, we haven't had really time to discuss it, this is something that came up during the campaign. It's something that comes up in Project 2025. And given that the U.S. is on track to build its first new nuclear weapons based entirely on new designs and new plutonium pit designs over the next 20 years, should be a real concern. We felt that no one benefits from escalating global tensions, and that a short-sighted decision to restart explosive nuclear testing for the first time since 1992 would result in the breaking of one of the last global nuclear taboos and lead to an even greater breakdown of nuclear norms. On top of that, the United States has tested its weapons more than anybody else. It would give up a significant real advantage that we have in terms of reliability in our weapon systems. Anyways, I know that was a lot. I hope it goes without saying that nuclear weapons policy is a critical issue for concern for this country. I hope that if anything, our report and our discussion here demonstrates that we need to reevaluate our approach before we commit ourselves to spending even more capital and resources on systems that it may not be feasible or even counterproductive to our national security strategy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and my other colleagues here, and looking forward to having a discussion and answering all your questions.
Great, thanks, Geoff. My job is to be the bridge between Geoff and Elizabeth, and I'm gonna make it quick. But I just wanted to amplify 2 points that Geoff made in passing that to me sort of speak to this problem of differentiating deterrence from coercion and the difference between what is necessary to deter and what is necessary to coerce. The truth is that nuclear coercion has a very uneven track record. If you think that deterrence hasn't been proved definitively, thankfully, because it hasn't failed, nuclear deterrence hasn't failed yet, and we hope it always stays that way. But part of what is driving the push towards the expansion of the arsenal is a notion that nuclear superiority is both achievable and necessary to achieve our broader strategic objectives. And the simple fact is that the evidence to back up the claims of nuclear superiority is badly flawed. One of the cases that we cite in the paper is during the course of the Korean War, at a time when the United States had essentially a nuclear monopoly. That did not deter non-nuclear China from intervening in the conventional war in the Korean Peninsula. They were not intimidated or prevented from responding with conventional weapons and conventional forces in that conflict. Another case that is probably more familiar to people as a case involving nuclear weapons is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Here again, one of the stories is that it was precisely our ability to overmatch the Soviet Union in our nuclear weapons that was the decisive factor in that confrontation. But aside from the fact that those nuclear weapons that were in theater at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis brought us dangerously close to a nuclear exchange, perhaps as close as we ever came in the course of the Cold War. And even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was prepared and in fact did eliminate a set of missiles in Turkey that were a core sort of demand on the part of the Soviet Union. So the United States made a critical concession in the course of that conflict. This was not simply a case of our nuclear superiority delivering to us some great strategic achievement. We were willing to negotiate, and correctly we did. One other quick point. Geoff mentioned how important it is to recommit to not engage in new explosive nuclear testing. The United States has not engaged in nuclear testing for decades now. We have very capable modeling, computer modeling that was based on those explosive tests that were conducted many, many years ago. What we emphasize in the paper, or at least mentioned in the paper, is that communities that once took it for granted that they were downwind from nuclear weapons tests, and yet most of those people were barely alive or were only very young, those communities would once again be downwind of nuclear weapons tests. There are so many reasons not to engage in new nuclear weapons testing, explosive nuclear weapons testing, and I really want to sort of foot stomp that. One last point, and then I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth. You hear a lot of people talk about peace through strength and the invocation of Ronald Reagan's memory as a rationale for a broad-based military expansion, not just on nuclear weapons. And it's true that President Reagan engaged in a buildup that he felt and many felt put the United States in a stronger position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But it's also Ronald Reagan who said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Ronald Reagan said that. So even Ronald Reagan understood this notion of nuclear warfighting was utterly absurd. So I want to transition to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, the way I would tee this up to you is you are expert in the one part of the world that has 50% of all unofficial nuclear weapon states. That is not the 5 official avowed nuclear weapon states under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but India and Pakistan obviously are nuclear weapon states and not part of that original 5. We are, I fear, in the midst of a crisis that we have not seen in a while. And here again, the fact that these 2 states are nuclear armed, what does that mean? But more broadly, what does U.S. nuclear weapons modernization mean for South Asia and mean for the rest of the world? How do you look at this research that we've done in our case about the U.S. nuclear modernization? How can you position that for us in a broader context?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Chris and Geoff. I really appreciated your paper and glad to have the opportunity to try to expand the ambit a little bit, because I think my answer to your question is that many of the difficult conversations and calculations that you all describe going on the US side, they're not exclusive to the US, right? These are conversations that are happening in the part of the world that I focus most on and beyond. And I think it's really important to recognize the structural drivers of a lot of these challenges that you all pull out, because there is learning that we can do by studying the US case. And I would also invert that and say, Geoff, to your point early on, that after the end of the Cold War, the US and the West largely took their eye off the nuclear ball. It has been a very live conversation in South Asia since the 1990s, since India and Pakistan tested in 1998. We've seen several nuclear tinged crises since then. And I think all too often, we do try to draw lessons from the Cold War and apply them elsewhere. But I think we're really coming to a moment, especially as we consider what the future looks like when, from the US perspective, we face, two peer or two near peer adversaries. There are interesting lessons that we can draw from I won't just say South Asia, I will say Southern Asia to include China in the mix here, in terms of multipolar nuclear competition, multipolar deterrence dynamics. And so would really encourage looking at Southern Asian and nuclear dynamics in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, with an eye towards lessons that we can draw for the US strategic planners as we think about how we need to position ourselves for the coming decades, certainly in the context of modernization plans, right? So I'll start big and then go small and try to keep this quick, right? Because there's a ton of ground to cover and I'm not going to do it justice. So I'll do wave tops for now, and then maybe we can get into a little bit more depth in Q&A. But suffice it to say that the conversations that are happening on modernization on the US side are also translating in various ways in the region. I think it's difficult to assess causality here, and I want to be clear that it's not a direct line. It's complicated. There are a whole lot of factors, but I think we have to come first to China, right? And for this, we look to assessments coming out of the Pentagon, for example, that China is rapidly increasing the pace of its own nuclear modernization to include expanding the size of its arsenal, projecting 1,500 warheads by 2035. The latest estimate said that the Chinese nuclear arsenal exceeded 600 warheads, which was more than double what was reported 5 years ago. So, things are happening quite quickly in China, and that has implications for the US-Chinese deterrent relationship, but also through what we call the strategic chain on down in Southern Asia. So as we've seen over the course of the past 4 years or so, there is a disputed border between China and India. And analysts and strategic elite in New Delhi are looking with a great deal of interest and concern, I would say, in terms of the modernization that is going on in China, what its motives are, what it means in terms of the nuclear balance between the two sides. These are two countries that have no first use doctrines, and that I think is significant in this case. But those NFU pledges are coming under pressure, and there are doubts that are surfacing in terms of what they might really mean in practice. There's been some great research that's come out from Indian colleagues looking at perceptions within India of China's nuclear modernization. And it feels to me like this is a moment where New Delhi is starting to ask difficult questions about what it means to have a China that is a more active nuclear competitor. And India is realizing that it has some gaps in its own arsenal here. According to the latest data that we have, estimates on the size of the Indian and then Pakistani nuclear arsenal, for the first time, India is estimated to have more warheads than Pakistan, so 172 versus 170. And so it's nothing hugely significant as of now, but I think there are signs that we can point to that India as well is perhaps starting to pick up the pace a bit in terms of its own nuclear arsenal. And then in Pakistan, right, where it's you see further on down the strategic chain, these rivals have been in overt nuclear competition since 1998, and Pakistan feels under intense pressure given what is a growing asymmetry between Pakistan and India, for example, just in the size of the economy alone. What that means in terms of conventional capabilities, where Pakistan has traditionally felt that its capabilities were more limited than those of India's, particularly given India's size. Analysts will dispute that, right? I think Pakistan has held its own conventionally, at least in near-term militarized crises with India. But where Pakistan has felt more secure is on the nuclear side, on the strategic side. And I think there are indications as this modernization push works its way down the strategic chain that perhaps that confidence in nuclear or strategic capabilities vis-a-vis India might be diminishing. And here I would also point to a piece of this that is less just in terms of the size of an arsenal, but also delivery systems, emerging technologies that are being incorporated in this mix in ways that could be significantly disruptive. We have to look not just at the countries themselves, but also at their external partners, right? So we see the US-India relationship deepening. We see the China-Pakistan relationship deepening, and those serve as vectors, perhaps, for the transfer of technology, the transfer of capabilities, of intelligence. And so I think I put this story together to demonstrate what feels to me a moment of really significant flux. And one where some of the assumptions that we have looking at this region and how it's operated over the course of the past 25 plus years post overt nuclearization seem to be shifting in meaningful ways. And I'll also point here more broadly, right? Thinking about realistic conversations over horizontal proliferation to allies and partners that hadn't been in that mix before. Conversations that have been happening across Europe, potentially South Korea, right? I'm not here to comment or an expert on the likelihood of that, but I will just say as those conversations perhaps gain steam, we also have to think about what that means for non-proliferation considerations, both in terms of horizontal proliferation, but also vertical proliferation, right? The US, at least under the previous administration, had significant concerns over perceptions that Pakistan was looking to develop long-range missile capabilities, for example. And so here we get back to the challenges of trying to deter future proliferation that I think are complicated in the world today, where there are ongoing modernization efforts simultaneously. Very briefly here on the crisis, and hopefully we can pick it up in questions too. So, South Asia is one of the few areas of the world where we do have empirical case studies of previous crises that have taken place under the nuclear umbrella. Most recently in the Balakot crisis in 2019, and now following this attack that we've seen in Indian-administered Kashmir, we're kind of in this moment of collectively holding our breath to see whether there will be Indian conventional military action forthcoming. If that happens, then we're potentially finding ourselves in a situation where we will put to the test some of these new conventional capabilities, right, that both sides have acquired since the last crisis in 2019, and also some of the lessons that they've taken from environments like the war in Ukraine, where we've seen new technologies enter the battle space. And what I worry about most in South Asian crises is it's not actually deliberate escalation, it's inadvertence. And I think this is a space where when we have new systems, new capabilities, and really a lack of useful communication channels to be able to talk through some of the misperceptions that can come out of these issues, that I think is a concerning scenario and one that we should all be mindful of. So I'll leave it there, but hopefully we can get into more depth.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. I actually, I'll pick up on that last point because I was thinking along these lines as well. There is, I think, because of the war in Ukraine and the nuclear saber rattling that the Russians have engaged in, there is, I think, a new discussion around nuclear escalation dynamics and the extent to which these kinds of threats are salient and what might be done to mitigate those threats or make those threats less effective and therefore less likely. That is one of the rationales that people make on behalf of tactical or theater level weapons is that somehow these weapons would give an advantage, an escalation advantage to those who possess them, or a disadvantage if they didn't. But I want to kind of talk through this. You mentioned it as it applies to the balance between India and Pakistan in South Asia. I am curious if you've heard in either in India and Pakistan or in the region talk precisely along these lines of the need for a different character of nuclear weapon to try to manage this escalation risk. Because as Geoff already alluded to, one of our main concerns as our paper is precisely the escalation risks, the discrimination problem that is introduced in theater in the midst of a crisis. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then, Geoff, if you want to jump in after Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things looking at these conversations in South Asia in comparison to in the US context or even in the Chinese context is developments are a bit delayed in South Asia, right? So we're seeing, for example, MIRVing is something that is has come into being in South Asia, and so technologies that have featured in various ways over time, and that we do actually have some knowledge on from the Cold War context have come to the fore in South Asia. So that's kind of a dynamic that's ongoing. Both sides continue to test missiles, develop new capabilities. On the discrimination problem, it is real and it varies across the region. So at least traditionally, India has sought to draw a pretty clear line between conventional and nuclear systems. On the Pakistan side, though, it has been more a policy of strategic ambiguity. So looking at that discrimination problem actually is a means of bolstering deterrence. If you don't know what's coming at you, you're going to be more restrained in your response because you have to plan against the worst case scenario. Of course, you can flip that back and say, yes, and you have to respond in case of the worst case scenario. But here, I think we are seeing some pressures just from pure economics, the cost of developing these systems, right? It is much more affordable to be able to develop a dual capable delivery system. And as there are pressures to modernize and, economic challenges along the way, you can look for areas to economize. And I think this is one that we are seeing increasingly across the region. And that is concerning. The other element here that feel somewhat relevant to this conversation too is just the lack of clarity and real information sharing on those capabilities. There aren't necessarily open dialogues on who's developing what and why, and to your point on deterrence and assurance, the other side of the equation.
Right.
I do worry as we look to modernize, and particularly in the context of a crisis, right, where timelines are tight, you're making decisions under pressure, and you're potentially thinking through scenarios in which new capabilities are fielded, that we don't have the mutual understanding or the structures in place to be able to exchange information on what that means. So much of this can be symbolic as well. And as you're looking to kind of calibrate, for example, low intensity conventional conflict or limited conventional conflict while seeking to remain well shy of those red lines that could push up against nuclear escalation, if we don't share a clear idea of how we're calibrating those red lines, it can get dicey. And I think as we see new systems, that's something that is certainly on my mind.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Geoff, you want to jump in?
Chris, I'm sorry, my audio cut out right at the top as you asking that question. Can you just repeat
just
it for me
about
again?
it's totally fine. Trust me when I tell you, Geoff, that I think Elizabeth answered that question
No,
really,
she
really
crushed
well. So I'm
it.
going to
Yeah,
move. We've got a bunch of questions in the queue,
yeah,
so
yeah.
we'll just plow right past
Perfect.
it. She knocked it out of the park. So you have nothing to add, actually. So the very first question we got pertains to from Benjamin Massengale. What makes you think the new U.S. nuclear weapons designs require a nuclear test? That's a great question because, again, we have developed weapons and not tested them on the basis of the computer models that were developed from the explosive nuclear tests of the 50s and 60s. And so not all advocates for a new warhead types claim that explosive nuclear testing will be required. That's true. But some have made the case explicitly for new explosive nuclear tests. Geoff mentioned Project 2025, which explicitly makes the case for new explosive nuclear testing. And then Robert O'Brien, President Trump's national security advisor from the previous administration, also made the case publicly for the need to revisit explosive nuclear testing. So it is an open question, and that's why we were trying to slam the door shut on it, because we think that it is not necessary, nor, in fact, would put the United States at a strategic disadvantage to take the lid off of explosive nuclear testing. So I'm going to take that question. I'm going to mark it live. Okay. To Geoff, there's a question from Anthony Valione about the NPT conference, and we're coming up on the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How might these new weapons that we talk about in this report affect the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and the disarmament agenda more broadly?
This is a serious question. This is a real problem too. I think that it's not inconceivable that a lot of countries around the world today that are NPT signatories are looking at the fact that the United States has pledged $1.7 trillion to new nuclear weapons activities, and now including is thinking about new, more usable nuclear weapons or theater-based nuclear weapons, maybe putting nuclear weapons back into Europe again. Very escalatory rhetoric from where we were and the original aims of that treaty were. And I don't think it's inconceivable that some people would say, wow, the United States thinks that it needs theater, weapons again. Maybe we need a piece of that too. I think that it's very disconcerting. Recently we just saw Germany, propose to France that maybe it extends its nuclear umbrella over Europe. Like these are open questions around the world, and I think that there is a significant risk of maybe not outright nuclear weapons proliferation, but maybe folks waiting in the wings start to raise the level of breakout threshold, right? So maybe we start enriching more nuclear fissile material, right? Maybe we start putting a little bit of money towards new missile technologies, right? And then maybe if this whole thing does fall apart, then they will be on the cusp of breakout capability. I think that is a very real danger looking ahead the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah. So we have two questions related to submarine launch weapons, the submarine portion of the MONAD, and also as it relates to the AUKUS deal from Benjamin Poole and from Scott Skragich. Ben Poole asks, what's the estimated cost of a submarine-based monad, and how well does it meet current nuclear requirements? There's a related question as it pertains to extended deterrence and NATO commitments. I think that's an excellent question. And then Scott asks about the Columbia and the AUKUS pillar 1, the so-called 1+2, the sustainment plan. We can see play out a competition for resources. There's an opportunity cost and competition for resources between the Columbia class submarines and the Virginia class boats. And what are the implications there? I don't know, Geoff, which one of those would you want to take? Because I'd take the other one, depending on what you feel more comfortable answering.
Sure, I could talk shipbuilding real quick.
Okay.
The sort of totality, I think the estimated Columbia class cost is $348 billion. I think the new CBO estimate for the next 10 years, without the associated warheads or new missiles or anything like that, was 140 something billion dollars over 10 years. But critically, and this comes up in every congressional hearing, is the sort of like shrinking size of U.S. shipbuilding, and the fact that that directly affects AUKUS is that we are actually pulling people off the Virginia lines to put them on the Columbia lines, which is, as Columbia has fallen to being 16 to 18 months behind schedule, productions of Virginia class submarines, which directly impact AUKUS, have fallen to like 1.2 boats per year, a significant decrease over the previous 10 years.
Yeah. And so I'll answer Ben Poole's question. We did not get into our report on the cost of the monad, but Geoff just mentioned the estimates on the Columbia class. The question about how does a monad fit into extended deterrence and NATO commitments, I think it's an excellent question. When submarine launched weapons first entered service in 1960, they were exclusively what we call second strike weapons. They did not have the accuracy to hit hard targets. They were not, as the jargon goes, counterforce weapons. But of course, now our weapons are much more accurate, and they are able to strike in a counterforce fashion, so you don't have to trade off those things. Another concern about submarine launch weapons over the years has been the communication linkages to these weapons, and are there vulnerabilities or weaknesses there? My prior research on this question have found that the communication linkages are weakest not between the shore to the ship, but from shore to shore. There are lots of vulnerabilities in the communication chain, and the communications to the ship is not the most weakest. So I think, and I have separately, we don't do it in this paper, but I have in other places, made a case for how you could continue to have extended deterrence commitments on the basis of a submarine-only monad. We understand that we don't call for that directly in this paper, but it's something that we certainly think is worth considering, especially when you take account of the technological advancements from today's SLBMs to yesterday's, and then factor in the future on both submarine launch weapons. Elizabeth, we have a question. We have a couple questions pertaining to South Asia. I don't know if you're looking at the questions that I am too. There's a question about no first use, that India has had a no first use policy, whereas Pakistan did not. Is that accurate? Has anything changed there? And what do you think? How would either of these two countries, or perhaps other nuclear weapon states, how would they respond if the United States, for example, were to adopt a no first use policy, which so far the U.S. has explicitly refused to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the immediate answer is that Pakistan does not have a no first use policy. It has a no first use policy, right? And I think in that we can see the asymmetries there, where, as I was mentioning earlier, perceiving India to be the conventionally superior adversary, Pakistan has always looked to its nuclear deterrent in order to stave off potential conventional Indian aggression. And we can see this, for example, at the tactical or battlefield level, where there was a lot of concern in Pakistan over the past 10, 15 years over what's known as the cold start doctrine. And there's been a lot of back and forth. Does it exist? Does it not exist? But the basic idea is this would be Indian broad ground incursions into Pakistan, testing out Pakistan's willingness to up the nuclear ante. And for that, Pakistan evolved what's known as full spectrum deterrence. And with that, developed tactical nuclear weapons, the Nasser system. And that is designed to, quote unquote, throw cold water on cold start and to cause Indian war planners to think twice before potentially mounting that sort of incursion into Pakistani territory on the understanding that the Nasser would likely be deployed to the battlefield. There are some questions over how realistic that is. There's a lot of back and forth on this, as you might imagine, but just strategically, Pakistan as a asymmetrically, conventionally weaker player in this has always leveraged its nuclear weapons in that way. And so I think, from that comes implicit instability and escalation risk. On the part of your question, in terms of a U.S. no first use pledge, it's an interesting question. It's one that I actually have not put to my regional counterparts. Going out on a limb here, I would imagine that it wouldn't get a great deal of it wouldn't be met with a great deal of confidence, put it that way. It would be seen as a meaningful step, but I don't think anybody's going to take it to the bank. And so I guess I don't think it would have a terribly meaningful shift in, how these countries think about their own doctrines or capabilities.
Right. Thanks. All right. So there have been several questions, and we've alluded to this about horizontal proliferation. That is the new nuclear weapon states coming online by virtue of a dwindling confidence in perhaps the U.S. extended deterrent or regional concerns. You mentioned these, Elizabeth, again, responses to Chinese nuclear modernization as it relates especially to India. I think this is worth engaging. And again, we don't get into this in the paper, but we've talked about it elsewhere. We've seen public opinion in South Korea in particular turn pretty decisively in favor of weaponization. The country Seoul hasn't made any moves in that direction, but once upon a time there was strong opposition in South Korea, and now there is a majority opinion believing in the value of an indigenous South Korean nuclear weapons program. How confident are the two of you on how close are we to, we talk about a nuclear arms race between the existing nuclear weapon states, which would be bad enough. How concerned are you about a new nuclear arms race that might even include new players or racers, or as the case may be? Geoff, I'll put that to you first.
Thanks. It's a great question. Like I said earlier, I think, this is sort of a knock on wood moment. My hope is that we don't see a bunch of horizontal proliferation, despite uncertainty, despite all this risk, all this calculation, a lot of political calculation about the future of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. These things that I said at the top about nuclear coercion becoming a fact of international relations again. I think it's more likely that what we should expect to see is the development of breakout thresholds, right? That a lot of people are sort of waiting to see where the chips fall. Is the United States going to sort of maintain its traditional role as the adult in the room and continue to work towards a world without nuclear weapons, as the NPT, proposes? And, will we find a step forward with verifiable arms control before the end of New START next year? I think that there's a lot of concern, and I imagine that what we will see in terms of horizontal proliferation is people starting to think about and look at their capacity for breakout. I think that that's the most likely near step.
Yep. Elizabeth, anything to add to that?
This isn't exactly the question you asked, Chris, but I think it's one that I would encourage us to take on board increasingly in these conversations. So I've had the privilege of being a part of a couple of workshops looking at the nexus between AI and the nuclear space in C3 in particular. And I think in some ways, I would echo Geoff's sentiments. I don't think I have anything to add there, but I would just encourage us to also think about those very significant enabling factors, right, that are fast being developed and don't map perfectly onto the nuclear halves. There are countries that have either now or likely future very advanced AI capabilities and access to those sorts of technologies that could be transformative, not just in a broader economic sense, but in a military one as well. And it's not impossible for me to imagine a world in which conversations over nuclear proliferation and arms control, because I want to get there too, are overlaid with other conversations on emerging technologies and AI. And I think that is a new piece of this puzzle, just as we explore new geometries and multi-actor deterrence and all the rest. It's not just the systems themselves, the arsenals themselves. It's what we can do with them and how we interact with them that I think increasingly will matter going forward. And that might be a slightly different group of countries, coalition, set of interests. And so as we think about how to, envision an arms control new system in this space, I think we have to expand beyond just nuclear weapons specifically.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that completely, Elizabeth. I mean, in traditional arms control, which is focused on warheads and delivery vehicles, like New START, for example, typically the Chinese have resisted any calls for engaging in a trilateral discussion because their arsenal has traditionally been so much smaller than both the Soviet and now Russian and U.S. arsenals. U.S. and Russia are much more like nuclear peers because of the number of warheads and delivery vehicles and whatnot. And yet I agree with you completely. I think there are opportunities, and in fact, more than just opportunities, real imperatives for us to consider the range of things related to potential nuclear use, nuclear escalation, nuclear command and control, and AI would be near the top of the list. And it seems to me that one of the benefits of engaging in arms control negotiations, even if you do not achieve caps or limits or reductions or things like that, but it's about engaging in a dialogue and trying to understand the various parties' sort of red lines, bottom lines, critical asks, things like that. In the case of AI and nuclear command and control, it is hard for me to conceive of any party to those negotiations being so confident that not limiting AI would deliver to them some decisive strategic advantage and not be as concerned or more concerned that in fact it puts them at a disadvantage. And that is, to me, the classic case of where you would actually have broad agreement on a starting point for some kind of negotiation. Geoff, you want to add anything? You have anything to that?
Just to double down, it's one of the few places politically here domestically where we have consensus too.
Yeah.
Both Republicans and Democrats, voted on a bill last year, attempting to limit, essentially saying that AI should not be involved in nuclear command and control policy, right?
Yeah.
I think in a world where there are less than 15 senators left who voted on New START back in 2010, you're right that just keeping this process, keeping the apparatus and the muscle memory of how we do these things, especially in the United States Congress, especially in the State Department, alive is essential. So why don't we start with something that there is already vast agreement on? I think that that's a great point.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Elizabeth? We're almost out of time. I think we've answered most of the questions. I wanted to give one final shout out for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it. The paper is Gambling on Armageddon, How U.S. Nuclear Policies Are Undercutting Deterrence and Lowering the Threshold of Nuclear War. It's available at the Stimson website, digital form. I get to have the fancy, shiny bound version on my desk. But mostly I just want to thank Elizabeth for joining us today. Thank my co-author, Geoff, and Lucas Ruiz. for contributing to this work. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I also want to give a shout out to our fantastic comms team here at Stimson, especially to Vanessa, who helped organize this today. We've had a busy couple days. Elizabeth and I pulled double duty 2 days in a row on Zoom meetings. So it's been really busy here at Stimson. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And I hope to see you again at future Stimson events. Bye-bye.